Hi, Zoe. How are
Hi,
you?
Rhode.
Thank
Good,
you so
thank
much for
you.
joining.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite. It's great to talk with you.
No problem. Yeah. You know, thank you so much for being here. And this talk really, I wanted to kind of have you come in and just chat about some of the work that you're doing. So I think like one concept that we talk about a lot in design is just like, how do we, especially as people of color, right? And in
Mhm.
a marginalized kind of community, how do we think about redefining design values and and how do we also just like understand and have conversations around the fact that design values are dominant, right? And a lot of the values that we use to drive decision making in teams today
Yeah.
are based on like century old kind of like Eurocentric values that don't necessarily represent us, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And I just feel like we're not having this conversation enough, but also I also think that it's not really, we're not at a place where we really understand it yet too. And so like I'd love to do that with you today, is to just kind of break out down like what the heck does this all mean,
Right.
and like what is the way forward, especially in the context of your work as well. So I'll just let you introduce yourself and take it from there to set that context.
Great. No, yes. Okay, so I'm Zoe Ene. I'm a designer like you at Microsoft, like you. And that's where we met and started talking about this. Um, Before Microsoft, I went to art and design school. I survived RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, where I got a degree in industrial design. And coming from there to Microsoft, that was about 3 years ago. And while at RISD, during my senior year, I started to think about a lot of these topics. Think about just, I guess, looking at my education and how I was taught the principles of design while at school. It became very clear that uh, the references that we were being shown and taught and that we were told to study and admire uh, were all based in I guess design history, but in a very with a very European gaze, I guess. And so it got me thinking, being Nigerian, it got me thinking about, I mean, other cultures around the world and what contributions they've made to design history. Because during those periods, those centuries, those periods of time, other cultures were developing as well. They had practices, they had ways of making things, they had ways of communicating, they had ways of problem solving. So the biggest question for me was, since we're supposed to be well-rounded designers, why aren't we, just for the sake of having that knowledge, why aren't we like considering an alternative way to problem solve that this culture did in this time? And even though that's not reflected in contemporary like design discourse, why isn't that part of foundation, our foundational design education, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So that's that's kind of been that was kind of an ongoing question, and that's what I've been trying to tackle with for a thesis project first, and then ongoing research now. But after graduating, I started work as a UX designer at Microsoft, and um, just designing experiences and thinking about like products, what kinds of people are going to be using our products. It's important to think about the design principles that we're using to design those products. So it's a very long introduction, but as you can tell, I'm quite like nerdy about this topic. But yeah.
Of course. But no, all of that is so important. I mean, we have a lot of initiatives now around like responsible AI, inclusive design, universal design, all of this is obviously on the top of people's minds. How do we start to really open our eyes and look critically at this so that we're building a better tomorrow at the end of the day? So I love that. I feel like these are kind of the things that I've thought about all for a long time as well.
Yeah.
Um, you kind of focused on a particular design value that is Igbo, right? And
Mm-hmm.
looking at like with Nigeria, right? And I'm from Nigeria as well, right? And so it's I really would like I think that's such an interesting perspective to say, hey, design values are not just Eurocentric, they're not just
Mm-hmm.
American. Other cultures also have design values that we've never taken into account because there's not been a space for us to do that, right?
Right.
And so I really love that, and I would love to kind of chat more about that idea of decolonizing design practice and you know focusing on a design value like Igbo design values, right? And defining what those are because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, but I've never heard of anyone come out with like, hey, here's the 5 principles of
Mm, good
Igbo
design
good design that
as
is
defined by the Igbos. Yeah.
as defined by, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, as defined by like people of color, period, or
Mm-hmm.
black women, like men, like you don't really see that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, can you talk a bit more about that?
So the whole kind of goal for the thesis statement, if you will, was to try and um, define principles of good design by studying objects made in the pre-colonial era um, of Nigeria, specifically objects from the Igbo people, Igbo society, um, and see how those principles of making, principles of thinking, principles of um, process, if you will, um, could be applied to a designer today, whether in the context then to a product designer or an industrial designer, someone who was um, considering, and actually not even limited to just people who design physical goods, if that makes sense, but
Mhm.
also thinking about how did the Igbos in that time think about setting up their systems, setting up, laying out, um, laying out their communities. What was
Mm,
their process of communicating, oral versus written, things like that. So um, it started out uh, in my uh, design principles lecture. We were in a large hall, low lights, trying to stay awake, just battling to stay awake. And our professor, we had a class in a movie theater. We'd rent out a movie theater and we'd have this class. And it was basically meant to teach us as industrial designers or industrial design students the history of design throughout the different eras. So through the industrialization period, the Art Deco period, and seeing how uh, because of industrialization and manufacturing, the rise of manufacturing, objects were starting to be systematized and made, and that's kind of what's driven the industrial design practice today. And we
mm,
did that by he taught primarily by just showing us pictures, pictures. And being Igbo, like I said earlier, I can help but notice that everything design history was rooted in Europe, and it made me wonder like what was going on in Nigeria at that time. Like I know that at the same time in school, we had everyone was required to take a history of arts and visual culture lecture, and in those lectures, you got to see um, objects and art from Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, from
mm,
all over the I guess non-Western world. And so, seeing all those things, I started to wonder, okay, there's obviously like in design education, there's obviously a dichotomy, like there's a split
mm,
between art and design, obviously. But
yeah.
I'm wondering why a lot of objects made in non-Western contexts are being viewed as just fine art or, you know, viewed to study, I guess, anthropology and just understand the people. And so we see what they crudely made, and we put them in museums, or if you're rich enough, you buy them and you put them in your very contemporary home.
Yeah.
You know, but in the study of design, which has a problem solving aspect to it, um, you know, you're faced with a need and you want to make something to meet that need. That's kind of basic understanding of design, right? And of course, there's more to it. But I started to wonder, why aren't we looking at some of the things that we're looking at in the history of arts and visual cultures lectures to define design? Because the people that made those objects at that time in those cultures, yes, a lot of them were made, or yes, those objects could be made for artistic purposes or just for self-expression, but a lot of them were useful objects. You know what I mean? Cups, bowls, chairs, um, headrests, and all these things that were contextual to that specific culture. So, for example, I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but um, uh, a lot of stools in made from Igbo communities were also kind of used as headrests as well, because they had like a scooped form to them. So it just
Mm.
showed in that specific context the specific need that they had, and they made their objects kind of interchangeable between those two needs. So I'm like, I don't see why we can't understand design and the nature of problem solving by also studying uh, other cultures in different points of design history. And, you know, it boils down to, I guess, industrialization and
Mhm.
how technology kind of, yes, boosted manufacturing, and that was all centered around Europe. But that
Yeah.
argument, you can't just kind of look at world history or that argument apart from the effects of colonialism and apart from, I guess, the suppression of other cultures, especially non-Western cultures, um, their own practices, their own ways of doing things, their own ways of thinking were kind of suppressed by Western cultures because of colonialism. And one could argue that their societies were not allowed to fully evolve, and other kinds of technologies were suppressed and things like that. So it was that's kind of the genesis and the first thing that got me thinking. Also, I remember coming across a quote by a guy called Adolf Loos,
Mm.
who was a European, he was kind of a diehard modernist, and he proposed a lot of modern architecture back in the day. And his quote, he said that the evolution of cultures starts with the eradication of ornament, and kind of modernization, the way forward was pure function. He has a book called, or a series of lectures called Ornament and Crime. And that quote kind of took like stopped me in my tracks, because being Igbo, being African, you understand how important ornament is in our our very aesthetic, right? So does that mean that cultures that embraced ornament were devolved cultures? You
Mm.
know, and so the very start of my thesis was kind of setting out to investigate that claim and
Yeah.
see,
And
you
when you
know.
say ornament, sorry, just to
Mhm.
clarify, when you say ornament, what do you mean exactly?
Ornament is defined as, or I think of it as motifs or added style that is put
Yeah.
on a surface or an object that really doesn't necessarily um, aid its usability, if that makes
Mm.
sense. Um,
Yeah.
so one of
And so
my right
kind of
as it
things that they kind of focus just on the visual, right? It's that the visual almost like flair rather than
mhm.
audio. Okay. Yeah.
Right, right. But you know, um, one of the first things that I wanted to investigate though was, okay, so in a culture like Igbo culture, are you telling me that um, their use of ornament was purely ornamental,
Mm.
ironically enough, like, or is functional ornament also um, part of their principles, right?
Yeah.
And I came across a chair that was designed by Igbo artisans, I believe in the 20s. I hope I'm not wrong, but I can clarify. And I can also send you a link if you wanted to display that in the
Yeah,
video.
that's great.
But it was a chair designed and made by Igbo artisans for, I believe, for visitors from England, from British visitors. So
Mhm.
a backrest, two seats or two handles, a seat,
Right.
and four legs. Right. That's not how a chair. Stools were more prevalent in Igbo society at that time, and also the chair didn't have any. The only binders that that chair had were pegs. So these wooden kind of interlocking systems. So you put two pieces together and you interlock them with a peg. And those pegs were all over every joint of the chair. But
Mm.
it added to it was also an ornamental feature because what they did was they crafted or they carved in figures, figures of human beings, figures of animals into each peg. So though the peg was functional, they and simplifying human form and animal form is a big design principle for or design pattern for Evos. So they put some of their own kind of design context into the design of that functional object, even if it's and also they consider the context of the person that they were designing for. They didn't give them a stool; they gave them a chair that they recognized, but yet they didn't suppress their own principles. Right, the pegs were covered in carved figures of heads, simplified heads, even some heads with pith hats on them, which is what the colonial visitors wore. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I remember looking at this chair and being like, and you're telling me that ornament can have some function to it, or you're telling me that this isn't a terrific example of design? Why weren't we shown this? Because it covers so many principles like tangible and intangible, right? The idea of understanding who your user is and saying, let's make sure that we design something that they recognize that is for them, that is in their context, right? But also being expressive and having your design um, not just have form and function, but also feeling. You look at this chair and it's beautiful and it uh, it's enjoyable on both a visual level, usable level. So um, it was things like that that made me start to think like, okay, what other objects could I study and could I look at since I've been shown a lot of images and objects from one side. Now let me, with this thesis, go and really look at images of objects from Igbo society and see what principles of design I can excavate and then kind of have a list and then try and apply them to a design process.
I That's so great. And I just want to touch on something you said, like, design is not neutral at the end of the day, like you
Yeah.
said, right? It does tell a story. And
Right.
so you're not actually capturing, yes, the form and the function, but also the feeling of,
Mm-hmm.
like, what really went into creating some of these objects or visuals or whatever it may be, then you're losing that. You're losing that over time. And I love, like, Nigerian author Chimamanda, he talks
Mm-hmm.
about, like, the danger of a single story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, like, that is the center of what that means.
Yeah,
If you're only telling
absolutely.
a story that's one-sided, that's, and you're kind of objectively saying, well, design should only focus on function because that's just what it should do. But
Mm-hmm.
that, says who?
It's important to note that you know, not every design principle from every culture is going to apply across the board. Not
Right,
all of that is
right.
going to be universal, which is the kind of the start of this whole investigation in the first place.
Yeah.
If if Adolf Loos said that thing about the evolution of culture being the the erasure of ornament, and if we look at specific European cultures today and see that a sleeker, more minimal aesthetic is preferred, whether
Yeah.
you attribute that to just technology and manufacturing and how it's easier to kind of create those simple forms, fine. But there are also specific European cultures that just prefer uh, less ornament or no ornament at all. And
Mhm.
how is that then kind of because of globalization, how is not that then applied to just the way our phones look, the way basketballs look, the way um, an app is designed? Everything is sleek and function first, which is
Yeah.
fine. But I'm just proposing, if we go back to the beginning and start to look at a different context, which is not a wrong context, but just a different context, how would that change the ways that our products look, the ways that our phones look, our basketballs look, our chairs
Mhm.
look, our apps look?
Yeah.
Um, all not like throwing away function, but what other things could be explored there?
Yeah.
Because I personally believe, and it's something that I want to um, try and prove as I continue this research, that
Mhm.
biomimicry should be the only definer of a universal design principle, or a universal definition of good design should come from nature, should come from
Mm.
biomimicry. If anything that exists naturally in nature is then replicated in the ways that we do things or the ways that we make things, then that is a universal principle of good design, and that applies regardless of culture. That's something that's just like a hypothesis I have, and it's
Yeah.
something I want to further explore. But yeah, just thinking of this, like, okay, there's culture as it applies to design,
Yeah.
and context. Things may work here, but it may not work
But it may
somewhere
not work.
else.
Yeah, I really love that and I think that can be probably our last point here. Like, to wrap that up, I think that is
Mhm.
really the core thing to me as well. It's, you know, I forgot the name of the guy that you mentioned earlier, but someone.
Adolf.
Yeah,
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 yeah. Adolf Loos. Yeah.
yeah, badgering his name. But so someone, Adolf can say, "Hey, like this works for the European context," and that is fine.
Mhm.
I think where the issues start to form is when you start to say, okay, based on the research that I've done on in the European context, this should apply to the entire world.
Right.
And this applies now to everyone. And that's where you really do start to realize that
Mhm.
we're not serving everyone.
Mhm.
However, we're creating products and experiences for everyone,
Mhm.
right? Most of the time, or
Mhm.
the products that we're building, the experiences that we're building in the big tech space are being used by people across the entire world.
Right.
Right? And so we should be able to think about those different contexts from the beginning, not just at the end, when we realize that, uh, auntie in Kenya, it like can't literally use the app that you designed because it's not even in her dialect, or
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
those are the things that we have to start thinking about from the beginning, is that context.
Absolutely.
Um, and
Absolutely.
yeah, and so thank you so much for just bringing your perspective. Like, there's so many different takeaways I feel like I could probably wrap up with, but I think that
Yeah.
was a really great one, right? It's
Yeah,
that.
and I think just to lastly include, because I do think something that also drives me wanting to pursue this research is, I think
Yeah.
it's important for people like us who are designers from
Mhm.
with heritage
Sure.
ties to, right, to a non-Western culture, because I'd also encourage you to look up Demas Nuoko, who
Mm.
he's still alive, a very prominent Nigerian artist and architect. In the
Mhm.
60s, he was also doing a lot of decolonizing design work, and he wanted to reinstitute like our own pre-colonial ways of architecture and expression
Mhm.
in contemporary architecture. And he found out that a lot of in the 60s, a lot of Nigerians didn't even know their own history. They didn't know their own aesthetic or artistic history. And that's part of what's driving me is let us start to learn our own context, our own
Yeah.
design history, so that as designers we're not just kind of defaulting to Europe or to a more world globally accepted aesthetic or
Yeah.
process, but we're understanding our history, and then that's informing how we create as designers too.
Yeah, and that's and I mean, it's also informing how we create space for that,
Yes.
especially as, we're able to, like, influence that decision making. We're able to influence that UI feature, or that
Mhm.
research study, right? I think this is, yeah, you're completely right. It's definitely, it comes down to us. It comes down to the stories that we're able to now tell. But then first we have to understand it
Yes,
for
exactly.
ourselves. You have
We
to
have
first
to relearn our own history.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And be reflective. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. So